You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Archaeology Show. TAS goes behind the headlines to bring you the real stories about archaeology and the history around us. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Archaeology Show, episode 316. On today's show, I talk to the writer, producer, and director, and the director of still photography for the new documentary about the world-famous Gault site outside Austin, Texas. Let's dig a little deeper. Welcome to the show, everyone. Joining me today is Olive Talley, writer, producer, and director of The Stones Are Speaking, the film we're talking about today, and Kenneth Garrett, director of still photography on that film. So I'm going to start out by just having you guys introduce yourselves first. And Olive, let's start with you.
Okay, great. First of all, thanks, Chris, for letting us be here and talk about our passion, the Gault site and the peopling of the Americas. I am a longtime journalist in radio wires, newspapers, and in television. And this is my first independent documentary film, perhaps my last too, because it was so hard to do. But it's been a 5-year labor of love. And the story, in essence, boils down to the history of the spectacular Gault site in central Texas and the backstory of Mike Collins and how he saved the site for history.
Fantastic. And Kenneth, clear a little bit about yourself.
Once again, thank you, Chris. I'm a photographer with National Geographic magazine, and I did a long series on human evolution, ending with the peopling of the Americas. And for the last 25 years, it's been a big passion of mine to go ahead and make it known to the world at large that people came long before the Bering Land Bridge Clovis theory. And Mike Collins was one of the sort of leading spokespeople. He was what I like to think of as kind of a paternalistic, calm, quiet voice of reason. And when I worked with him in 1999, he said, I have pre-Clovis in Texas, but nobody believes me. So I said, I believe you, let's go. So we went down and I photographed him there. It's been a passion of mine ever since then. And when I told this story to Olive in Antarctica in 2017, she took the bait, and here we are today.
Fantastic. Well, I want to talk about that story a little more and how you guys came to actually be making this film. But let's talk about the Gault site a little bit more. I feel like listeners to this podcast, a fair number of them probably have heard about the Gault site. I know most archaeologists have heard about the Gault site. So, Olive, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Gault site and just kind of a quick synopsis of what we're talking about. Located just outside of Austin, Texas, correct?
Yes, it's about 45 miles northwest of Austin. I mean, literally, not that far from the state capital of one of the largest states in the United States. And here in this little creek valley along a spring-fed buttermilk creek lies one of the most important archaeological sites in the Western Hemisphere. The Gault site has been determined to have evidence and artifacts showing human life here going back as far back as 20,000 years ago. It is, so that makes it Mike Collins calls it older than Clovis because he cannot say that it is a direct antecedent to Clovis, so he will not use the term pre-Clovis. He's that precise. So he just merely says it is older than Clovis. It is also the most prolific Clovis site in North America. Over 2.6 million artifacts have been found here, and about that from the Clovis period forward, and 150,000 of those date older than Clovis in what they're calling the Gault assemblage. So it's a site that adds a huge amount of data and that dispels a lot of notions and preconceived ideas about how people were living on the continental United States, back in Paleo-Indian times and earlier. It's a significant site. It helped us rewrite what we thought we knew about the first people in the Americas. Ken, I'm sure you can add to that.
One thing that defines anatomically moderns from our predecessors in the hominid line is long-distance trade for raw materials. The site at Gault is an excellent It's the church. Now I can't think of the name of the formation. Edwards Church. That formation of church was a raw material that people came from hundreds or thousands of miles away to get this raw material. And to make stone tools 20,000 years ago, that was survival or not survival. So it was a destination where people came to get a critical raw material for their survival. So for over 20,000 years, there was water, there was decent hunting, but they came for that raw material site.
Brilliant.
Among other things, that's why you see so much evidence, because they take off a big nodule and then they'd flake it down into what we'd call a big hand axe or something. And then they could carry that away as a raw material that they could then make more blades from later when they got back to their other home. But it was where they went, they'd knock off flakes in order to get the material to be portable. And then they'd move on back to wherever they came from. But it was the destination for getting super important raw material.
Yes, one of the archaeologists said it was a stone tool factory, and we quote that person in the film. So people would come here seasonally, and they would, as Ken said, and as the archaeology discovered, they repeatedly came here season after season. They were living off the land. They knew the animals. They knew what they would find here. They had water, a shelter, the church. It was just an ideal place for prehistoric occupation.
Nice. Yeah, to have the source material there and to have all the, plentiful water, wildlife, everything you need, it was really an ideal location. And probably people live there full time too, I would imagine sometimes. And that probably caused some conflict, I would imagine, as well. But it's interesting you're saying too, the 20,000 year history, because my wife and I, as listeners to the show know, live in our RV, and we just spent a summer in Alaska. And on the way to Alaska, we stopped in the Yukon, because you have to go through the Yukon if you're not taking a ferry. And we went through the Yukon, and they've got in Whitehorse the Yukon Beringia Interpretive Center. And just seeing the graphics they've got, and they fully acknowledge up there, to their credit, that obviously the Beringian land bridge was not the only probable entrance point into the North American continent, or even South America for that matter, right? They're not saying that, right? So it's a really cool interpretation of sort of all of the Americas, and this is their one little part of it, which was kind of neat. So,
right.
Another kind of little interesting fact about the Gault site. One of the things I really loved about the film was you guys actually made it really accessible, in that there's not a lot of, I would say, complex terminology that needs to be defined, because some of the things that you're talking about, like this is what archaeologists would call a quarry site, and sort of hand axe type shape that Kenneth was talking about that people would take away. While that can be used in a tool in its own right, we would typically call that some kind of a preform. So that can be shaped into something else, or like an early stage biface or something like that, just from a technical standpoint, right? So, but it's really cool how, they were finding so many things. I've seen maybe 2 or 3 Clovis points in my career as an archaeologist in the field, fresh new ones.
Yeah, right.
People were saying they'd seen more in their entire lives in one day. At the Gault site. Yes.
When Mike Collins, who, by the way, drove a vehicle that said Clovis on his license plates, when Mike Collins came up to the site the second time in 1998, the then landowners had found what later determined the scientists determined to be a mammoth jawbone, but they were so fixated on this bone down in the bottom of this pit, and Mike was looking all around in the back dirt and seeing more Clovis artifacts in one location than he had ever seen in his entire career. And it was a candy shop, for archaeologists, and especially people who love this Paleo-Indian world. That's
awesome. Love it. He definitely, you need those big picture people out there on those sites. You always have your focused people that are really detailed and detail oriented on a single thing, and you need them as well. But the big picture people bring it all together and really kind of help expand it out. So, all right. Well, to try to wrap up this segment, I want to hear more about the story about how you guys met, the telling of the story about this site, and then how you decided to just make a film about it and where that came from.
Okay. Can I start, Ken?
Yes, please.
Okay. Chris, I was just darn lucky that I had some friends in Austin who convinced me and took me on a trip to Antarctica at the end of 2016, early 2017. Ken was the Nat Geo photographer on the trip, and he was giving us a lecture about the peopling of the Americas. And he was showing us, of course, all of these sites where he's been and he's photographed. And then he showed a slide, and it had a red star in the middle of Texas, and it said Gault. And he said, and when the boys in Texas started finding stuff that was older than Clovis, heads started turning worldwide. Well, all of us Texans sitting in the audience, our heads started turning because we're like, what? We've never heard of this place. What are you talking about? How can there be such an important site in Texas and none of us know anything about it? We've never heard about it. So for the rest of the trip, I was tugging on his sleeve or whispering in his ear or poking him in the shoulder and saying, excuse me, I have one more question, Ken, about this. And then, Ken, what did you do?
Of course, I'm the guest lecturer, as it were. And so I figured, well, I'll just suggest maybe one day we could do a story. You could write a story and I could take the pictures. Let's call Mike Collins and see, what the updates are since the last time I met with him. And then I just tossed that out on the table and thought nothing will come of that. And then we talked to each other again once or twice. And the next thing you know, Olive calls Mike Collins and talks to him for 4 hours. And then Mike Collins says, well, this isn't long enough. You need to come and visit me and I'll show you. And by the way, you need to plan to be here for 4 days.
Right.
So that was more than 5 years ago. She spent the first 4 hours on the phone, the next 4 days visiting the site, and the next 5 years making the film. So it was a simple little idea, like maybe we could do a magazine story someday. And now here we are today, 8 years later, with this incredible film.
Almost 9 years, but who's counting, right? But I mean, Chris, it's been a labor of love. And I wanted to do, as Ken said, a magazine piece and sort of combine our journalistic talents. But they didn't have the date on the site at that time. They still had samples that were out for OSL testing because they used 2 or 3 different labs. So I was waiting on that. And in the interim, while I was waiting, I got involved in another project and another documentary. And then suddenly I hear in 2018, not only do they have the dates, but they've published in Science Advances. And by the way, I'm listening to one of the archaeologists on the radio in Texas. And I just thought, well, I've missed this story. But Chris, it just gnawed at me. It was one of those things that I couldn't let go of because I knew nothing about archaeology. But when I met Mike Collins and I began to dig into his story and the story of how he saved this site, I was as smitten, if not more so, with him and who he is and what he represents and his contribution to archaeology as much as I was the particulars of the science of the site. Some of my former colleagues in journalism sort of described me as a dog with a bone, and I guess I can be that. And so I devoted 5 years, and Ken helped in every way possible, and he provided photographs that he took of Mike and the site in 1999 as part of this National Geographic magazine that he was talking about, that edition in 2000. And we just collaborated, and like we both said, here we are. And we're thrilled that the public is finally beginning to learn about the site, and particularly Texans, because this is a gem in their own backyard. And still to this day, most people have no clue. They've never heard about it. They don't know anything about it, and they're fascinated.
Okay, well, this is awesome. All right, so let's take a break, and we're going to talk about the Gault site and Michael Collins a little bit more on the other side of the break. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to the Archaeology Show, and we're talking about The Stones Are Speaking. Take a look in your show notes. We have links to the website so you can see more information about the film and where you can see the film. We are talking to Olive Talley, the writer, director, and producer of the film, and I'm going to ask Ken right now, who was the director of still photography and who was actually the first one of the two to meet Michael Collins, back in, I think you said it was 1999, late 90s anyway. Just give us your impressions of Michael Collins, because one of the things I took away from the film was Olive did a really good job of telling the story, not about the Gault site, not just about the Gault site and of Dr. Michael Collins and the scientist and how he does that, but of the person Michael Collins and how he, just like what kind of a guy he is and what kind of a person would, choose to live the life the way that he did and interact with the people that he had to interact with, namely the landowners, and the way that he bought the site and then donated it. All of it was just fascinating. Just tell us your thoughts and impressions of Michael Collins.
Okay, let's see, where do I start? Just to start out, I want to say that Mike Collins, to me, was like a real stand-up guy that told the truth, that was a good aggregator of information. When I first met him, the National Geographic had put together what we called a blue ribbon panel of all of the people in the Americas scientists: C. Vance Haynes, Dennis Stanford, Jim Addabasio, Mike Collins, Dave Meltzer. And we all went down to Monteverde in Chile to look at Tom Dillahay's work down there. So he had dates that were several thousand years older than anybody wanted to believe, and a little bit like Addabasio, who they said got carbon in his dates in Pennsylvania from the coal mines. They wanted to discount Tom Dillahay's work. So the National Geographic paid for the plane tickets and sent 12 scientists down to look at the site, look at the work, look at everything. So you can imagine this was an emotionally charged group of people, half of which had it, their tenure was based on their side of the story and they didn't want anything to change. And the other half of the people were willing to look at new information and move the story forward. I'm biasing my own side here. Anyway, out of all of this group of people, Mike Collins was one that I went to on a daily basis to say, what did they really mean when they said that? What's going on here? Tell me what's really happening. And he was the solid, stable voice of reason in this group of scientists that were all pretty high-strung and all had their own agendas. I went out to shoot aerial photographs at sunset while all the scientists went to a bar and put pitchers of beer on the table. And there was a lot of kicking and harassing under the table. But I came back from shooting the aerials and I went to talk to the science writer for the magazine. And I said, what happened? What happened? And he said, well, they all decided that Dillahay's work is good, that he didn't do anything wrong, that his dates are good, and we have to accept Monteverde as much older than Clovis, and it's all the way down in Chile. But in the middle of all that, I developed a trust and a relationship with Mike Collins. And he said, I've got older than Clovis here in Texas, but nobody wants to believe me. And I go, I believe you. Let's go. And so I went to visit him in Austin. We went out to the site. We went up to his ranch. We took a bunch of pictures. Maybe it was 4 days, but I don't think so. I think I got away with 2 days. But I had a nice time with him. But he was the solid voice of reason that I respected. And since that time in 1997, 1999, 2000, I'm actually a consultant on National Geographic's history textbooks. And when they show me this textbook that shows the Clovis land bridge as the only way that we got into the Americas, I told them, you can't do this anymore. We're the National Geographic. We have to tell the truth. And the textbook publisher told me that's the answer to the question on the standards of learning test that all children have to answer if they want to get a good grade on their standards of learning test. So the National Geographic can't even tell the whole truth in their own history book because of the standards of learning test. But so it's been a passion of mine to find out what the real truth is for the last 25 years. And Mike Collins was my advisor, mentor on all that.
Wow, that's fantastic. The voice of reason, I think, is such a good way to describe him. I mean, I've never met Michael Collins. I wish I had, but I know actually a number of people that have actually met him because there's a lot of archaeologists that have gone through that university and I know people that have worked at the Gault site when they were volunteers. And he's always described as somebody who, was very matter of fact, very, tells you the way it is and isn't going to embellish. And I do like all of what you said earlier about him interpreting his pre-Clovis material, but not even talking about it that way and just being, listen, I'm not going to make any judgments here. We know what we know, and I'm going to say it the way that we know it. to get more information, which is how all archaeologists should speak.
Yes,
yeah.
He's so precise in his language. Now, not exactly now because of his memory issues, but when I first met him, oh my gosh, I would, as a reporter, I would try to repeat and summarize what I heard to make sure that I understood it correctly. And inevitably, he would say, well, almost, Olive, and then I would have to change a few words and be more precise. And I thought, oh my God, this guy could drive you nuts as a professor. And in fact, I asked Dick Boisvert, who was studied under him at the University of Kentucky, and then later got his PhD under Tom Dillehay after Mike Collins helped give Tom Dillehay a safe landing spot when he had to leave Chile because his life was threatened under the Pinochet regime. But anyway, well, I asked Dick, I said, did everybody just love Mike Collins? Isn't he just so smart and engaging? And he ignites your curiosity. And Dick looked at me and he sort of shook his head and he says, nope, not everybody loved Mike Collins, because if you didn't perform and if you didn't give the right reasons for the right answer, he didn't accept it. And, we put that in the film because he said you can't be right for the wrong reasons. You have to be able to justify and explain your answer, and it must be rooted in data and hard science. It can't just be a theory. So Mike Collins, if I could just add to that, Chris, he's not only a superb scholar, but he is a superb human being. And to your question and your point while ago, he and Karen have devoted their lives to public education and sharing knowledge and sharing information. And he is, to me, one of the most remarkable people I've ever met. And I've been a reporter for almost 50 years, and I've covered astronauts and politics and science. And there is no one quite like the pure altruistic person that Mike Collins is. I've just never met anybody like him. He's just devoted to acting for the greater good. And that is truly what compelled me all of these years to stick with this and tell this story, because he represents the standard. He represents the values that we need to strive for today. And in this divided world that we live in, he stands for integrity and science and truth and education and sharing of information and questioning. That's what science is about. You question things that you come up with. You question hypotheses. And he was always open to let the data and the science dictate that. And so he was willing to push the envelope on that, because he questioned the Clovis theory as a very young person, even as a teenager. So I just admire the fact that he was willing to stand on principle, and he put his money where his mouth was.
Wow, that's really well said. I love it. And I totally get that too. That came through from the film. I just want to let you know that, right?
Oh, good. Yeah.
And that's one of the other questions I want to ask you is, what would you say your mission statement for the film was? Like, when you set out to film this, obviously you had to get certain shots, talk to certain people. I wasn't sure what I was going to see when I sat down to watch it, right? I was like, is this a biography of Michael Collins? Is this about the Gault site? And it was kind of about both, right? But what is
Yes.
When you sat down, what was your mission statement for the film, and did you stick to that, or did it kind of evolve and end up what it was?
That's such an astute question, Chris. The answer is, I thought I had a plan, and then it changed several times over and it evolved. And I really, in the end, felt like I was trying to weave three different narratives, and you've named two of them. One, what is the Gault site and why is it significant? Two, how did Mike Collins save it? But to even understand any of those questions, then you have to get into who is Mike Collins. and what drives him. But then you had to put it all in context, right? That's the whole premise of good archaeology. You must put everything in context. So the only way that I could explain this was to put it in the context of the larger story of the peopling of the Americas. But to do that, then you had to explain a little bit about Clovis and the Clovis theory and the paradigm shift and these competing theories of how people came into the Americas. And oh, by the way, let's not forget the Native American theory that people were born of this land. And they were here even before people migrated from other parts of the world. So I just tried to give credence to all of this larger contentious debate about the who, what, when, where, and how of the peopling in the Americas. But I felt like the only way that people would engage in this is to engage with Mike the very way that I did. He hooked me in. He saw my curiosity and he just fed it and fueled it. And that's what he does with everybody. And I thought, okay, it's going to be a boring story if I just focus on the facts of the Gault site, but it's a much more emotionally compelling story if you meet Mike many ways the way that I did, and then we just follow the trajectory of his journey and the challenges that he overcame, both within the profession and with funding and with skepticism and all of the myriad challenges. And we name most of them. How about weather too? Flooding and snow, and I just felt like I needed to try to weave those three themes together. And let me tell you, it was not easy. There's a reason it took 5 friggin' years to get this done. So, but thank you. And I appreciate talking about it. And I appreciate you letting us talk about it, because I think it's a story that should and hopefully will inspire others to not only understand the importance of archaeology and the preservation of these cultural sites, but to hold up and shine a light on Mike Collins and say, this is who we need to be. We need to be this kind of a person. This is the gold standard.
Well, like I said, I think you definitely achieved all that. And I feel like there was a fourth player within this as well that was probably difficult to navigate and difficult to tell the story well. And that's the story of I'm trying to remember the exact, the Lindsay family, the landowner.
Yes.
Right?
Hal Lindsay, yes.
Yes, because, man, I really didn't know where that was going to go telling this story, right? Like it seemed like, but I was like, well, she's actually interviewing them, so it couldn't have gone that badly. They're willing to talk about it. So, but like, where is this thing going? Because it was hard. It was tough to see where that was going to end up in the end, given kind of how it started and this whole, pay to dig philosophy that they had to, and there's a lot of people doing that around the country, honestly, when they have resources, because they're trying to pay their bills. And there's people around the world doing that, trying to pay their bills. And you almost can't fault them for it and just march in with your flag and say history is more important than you eating food on your table, But
Right. Well, Chris, you understand it very well. And I want people to draw their own conclusions about the Lindsays. I personally respect the Lindsays. I personally like the Lindsays. And what I think you see through their own interviews and hear in their own words, they changed. How? Because they learned, because they became educated. I mean, Howard and Dorothy both say, we didn't know. We didn't know we were destroying history. We were collecting these artifacts because that's what everybody did. And they ran with the circle of people who did that. And then once they became aware and they got to meet, Bruce Bradley and Dick Boisvert and Mike Collins and Clark and all the other team, all the people that were there, and they loved it. And Doris, in one version, I know we cut it out, but in one of the versions, she said, well, if I had known archaeology was this much fun, maybe I would have gone to school to study to be an archaeologist. So, that to me is just the byproduct of the way that Mike approached them. Mike didn't vilify them, didn't turn them into the bad guys. And he educated them to come around to do the right thing for the right reasons. And I don't think there's anybody on the planet who could have managed that whole situation and thread that needle the way that he did. And I chose to follow his example. And that's what he did, and that's what I did. I approached them honestly and directly and straightforwardly and gave them the opportunity to tell me anything and everything. And I asked the hard questions, but not in a mean way. And they answered them very honestly with a great deal of integrity. So,
Indeed. All right. Well, fantastic. That sounds like a great place to end this segment. We'll come back and wrap this up on the other side. Back in a minute. Welcome back to the Archaeology Show. And we're going to wrap up this segment on the Stones Are Speaking. Check out the film in the show notes. Website is basically the same thing, and you can find out where to watch it and all that from the website. We found out, Olive, from you last segment, what your sort of mission statement for the film was, what that became. What do you want viewers to take away from the film? I'm going to ask both of you this. Start with Olive. What do you want people to, if they only learned, took one thing away, because, people in this day and age have a short attention span. What do you want them to take away from this film? What's kind of a key component?
I want people to take away from this film the thought that history matters, that saving cultural sites matters, and that all of us need to be like Mike. Maybe that needs to be put on a t-shirt. I dig this film and I want to be like Mike, because Mike epitomizes the integrity, the attitude, the altruism for acting for the greater good that applies far beyond archaeology. He just happens to do that in this setting. But he and his wife, Karen, have devoted their lives to saving history, preserving history in all manner, ranging from the Gault site to this historical home that they have in Austin that reflects the history of the Republic of Texas and through the Civil War and beyond. These are just incredible, giving, generous, educated people who care that we all know our history. And if you take nothing else from the film, it's that you learn about history, that you care about history, because surely if we pay attention to our history, maybe we have a chance of not repeating some of the mistakes that we've made in the past.
Kenneth, what about you?
Okay, did a great job on that. From my side of it, I was always focused on my passion of trying to get people to understand that the picture was much more complex than the simple Bering land bridge and coming across the frozen tundra, hunting animals that had been extinct for 2,000 years, and down through an imaginary ice-free corridor east of the Rocky Mountains. It just didn't make any sense. We had so much knowledge of all these other crossings from the west, from the east, in South America, across the North Atlantic, up the Aleutian Island chain. Why weren't people willing to be curious? Why weren't people willing to look at all the other evidence and go back to the drawing board and come up with a new process for looking for the truth? She took that, which was my focus, and then added the whole dynamic of Mike Collins and what a stand-up guy he was and how he was doing the right thing, and made it a much more interesting and involving, and you get sucked into the film because you want to be Mike's friend. You want to understand what he's up to. You want to understand how it is that he's doing such a great job of preserving this heritage. And I'm looking back at the back of my mind. I want people to go out and look for more sites that are pre-Clovis so that we can understand how people came. And I long believed that we all came by boat, but getting a little off track there. But what I want people to be curious and to go back to the drawing board and keep looking for answers. We don't know the real answer yet. And so I want people to look for more answers. And Olive did a good way of investing people in the story of Mike and Gault and the people in the Americas. And among other things, this past weekend, there were a group of young science students that came up from Houston to visit the site. So she's inspiring a new generation to want to understand where we came from and how we got here and what is the real story. And back all the way back to 1997 with the blue ribbon panel going down to Monteverde. There's a lot of controversy. There's a lot of people that don't want things to change. But the more people look at new options, the more people have an open mind, the more we're going to learn about what really happened. And having a new generation of kids come up and be invested in this site, I think is magnificent. And that's a byproduct of the film.
I mean, I have to agree with both of you because healthy skepticism is obviously a good thing, right? But that being said, on this show, we don't do interviews all the time, but most of the time we have 3 segments, as our audience knows, and we cover a news article that's popular in the news space today. And we don't go to typically the journals. So we'll use those as our backup sources to see where the news article came from. But we like to look at the headlines coming from where people, regular humans, are actually seeing these things, right? So you open up your Apple News or your Google News, and it doesn't matter where it's coming from. These are the headlines people are seeing. And every time you see an article that's like, archaeologists are stunned, or scientists are baffled, or something like that, it's like, well, they're not really. And, most of these people do have sort of an open mind, I would say, these days, coming down to it. And it hasn't always been that case. But the one thing I would take away from all of that, and then just learning from somebody like Michael Collins, is that we don't know the full story. And it's incredibly more complex than we ever thought it was. And the things we learn by just continuing to learn and excavate and then look at the world from a global perspective, almost every single site and every single cultural area, you just pull yourself out of that single myopic sort of concept, and you get to see the bigger picture. And that's another thing. That's the one thing I took away from Mike from looking at this, is really looking at the bigger picture, which I don't think enough academic archaeologists in particular do, because they get so focused on their study areas.
Well said, Chris. Well said, Ken. Yes, all the above, all the above. It's open your mind, be curious, be to learn new things. I mean, it's a fascinating world. It's all this stuff that these archaeologists and all of these, this array of scientists who were involved with the archaeologists. I mean, there's really neat stuff out there to be learned. Let's go get it. Let's learn it.
Ken, you mentioned people going down to the Gault site just last weekend to visit it. I know they put up a building. It belongs to the Archaeological Conservancy now because obviously it was donated by Michael Collins and his wife. What is going on there now? Is it a study and learning site, or are they doing any excavation continuing, or what's happening with it?
I'm going to kick that back to Olive. They have a small museum there, but there's a foundation that has plans for the future.
Okay, yes. The Gault School of Archaeological Research runs the site and manages it, even though it is owned by the Archaeological Conservancy, because that is the entity that Mike donated the property to. GSAR that has put up 12 signs and exhibits, which Ken graciously offered photographs that are on those signs now. And they lead tours through 2 different museums, the Bell County Museum, the Williamson County Museum, and through the Gault School itself. And there are more kids and more students coming out to the site. The tour numbers have increased exponentially as a result of the film. And that makes my heart go pitter-pat. And the kids are coming out and they're engaged. And I mean, it's just sparking a lot of interest and a lot of curiosity. There are plans to try to build it into a larger educational facility. I think in the coming months, you may be hearing about a capital campaign that the Gault School will be waging, and I will try to help and support that as well. But right now, the site is covered up. It still looks like that little cow pasture that I saw back in 2017 when Mike first took me out there, and I was going, I don't get it. How can there be such an important place? And he goes, it's under your feet, Olive. It's under your feet. So, but people still have that same reaction, and there's still pieces of chert lying on the ground. And, but it's a special place, and there are tours, and there will be more educational opportunities, hopefully with a little more funds coming in the coming year or so.
I mean, speaking of that, with the more funds, with the importance of this site pretty much solidified in national and international history, is there any plans or long-term plans to try to buy more land in order to do further excavations?
Excellent question, Chris. I think they would always be open to that sort of thing. Right now, there are no plans for further excavations, but I can assure you that the Buttermilk Creek complex is large. Mike Waters at Texas A&M has done research on the Friedkin site, and it's really a few hundred yards downstream, and it's the same site. Everybody knows it's the same site. People weren't bifurcating this little creek bed. They're wandering all along the creek bed. So there is some research being done in adjacent properties where they're finding locations where people there was a lot of outcropping of chert, and people would dig out these big nodules, and then they just bring them down to the creek because it was a lot more pleasant to be sitting under those pecan trees along the creek than it was to be on the more drier, higher hillsides. But I'm sure they would consider, meaning the Conservancy and the GSAR, would consider further research opportunities, but they want more science and technology to evolve. They want new questions to arise. So I don't think anything's going to happen anytime in the very near future, but there's always a possibility and an intriguing potential for more excavations along that whole Buttermilk Creek site in the future with the right time and the right approach and the right questions and the right technology that could justify going back into a site like this.
Olive, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but most of the people that were digging for arrowheads were working along the edges of the creek and over along near where the outcropping of the chert was. And Mike used his archaeological instincts to find an open space out in what I would call the floodplain that was maybe 30 meters from the creek and dig down into what would have been undisturbed area. But the way I see it, there's quite a bit of undisturbed area, and that most of the treasure hunters were really just digging along the edge of the creek. So I believe there's a lot more that could be found in undisturbed areas, but I could be wrong about that.
Well, you're right, but there was extensive digging in the upper 3 to 4 feet. But Mike will tell you, and of course he's very humble, but he said, I just got lucky, and I found this place. And they really did two digs where they found what appears to be a stone floor that was only about 4 feet, at most 5 feet, maybe 3 to 4 feet, but it could be the floor of a little hut. And that dated back to 15,000 with OSL. But the Area 15, which was the deepest pit and the last area of excavation, that indeed had a little bit of disturbed deposits at the very top because they found a row of beer cans. But once they got past the first foot or so, it was that pristine layer cake of time. And you saw the artifacts hit right on all the right intervals, and the stratigraphy was phenomenal. And you went all the way down to, you got through Clovis, and then you had a sterile zone. There was nothing, and then you hit the older than Clovis deposits. So whether or not you would be able to actually find another place exactly like that, maybe, but probably not in that 35 acres, but certainly maybe somewhere down along the creek. But I don't know. That's above my pay grade. I don't really want to venture to guess on that. And Ken's much more scientifically knowledgeable than I am. But I, one would hope, and I think that if they come up with the right questions and the right approach, and we get a little bit more advancement in some of our scientific tools and technology, I think there's every reason to believe that there could someday be another excavation at Gault. And boy, would I want to be there for sure.
Sure. Well, I'll just say, following on all that, one thing we always tell our listeners to remember is that when you take all of this in and you've got all these data sources, you've got everything, this is just, again, keep an open mind, like we said, and there's so much more out there. Textbooks seem to be written in such a definitive way because that's how textbooks have to be written half the time, right? They don't often say, well, we think, stuff like that. Textbooks are written like textbooks, and that's just the way it is. And I don't know if we're ever going to change that. But you just have to understand when you're reading there's so much left underground right now for archaeology and our history around the world that we're just literally scratching the surface, not to have a bad pun. Literally just scratching the surface on that. So,
Mike would be proud of you for that pun, Chris. He's a punster. Yes. Yeah.
Indeed. Well, again, thanks a lot. We'll link to the website where you can click on the menu and there's a where to watch. YouTube, Apple, and Amazon, yes, are all places where you can watch this film, and I highly recommend it. I didn't even notice the time go by, to be honest with you. Sometimes some documentaries can grind on by, I'm not going to lie, but some just kind of grip you and take you along for the ride, and this one did that, I feel like. So it was well worth it.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. My heart's going pitter-pat again. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you both. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to The Archaeology Show. Feel free to comment and view the show notes on the website at www.archpodnet.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at archpodnet. The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultural Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with AutoQuote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.